Good afternoon, everyone. I hope that everyone is doing as well as possible, given the circumstances. My name is Marcus Lee. I am a PhD candidate in political science, and I will be co-moderating this session on HBCUs and Black studies. Before we jump into discussion with introductions, I wanted to take a moment to thank the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture, Riley Snorton, Tracy Matthews, Marilyn Willis, Jacqueline Gaines, and Tiara Kilpatrick, as well as the academic unit committee for making this event happen. For those just becoming acquainted with us, we formed that committee in the summer of 2020 to explore the possibility of funding a new department devoted to the study of race at the University of Chicago in the wake of faculty, student, and staff mobilization with the More Than Diversity campaign and the global flurry of insurgency and protest against anti-Black state violence and white vigilantism. In this speaker series, we are soliciting advice from experts in the field of race and ethnic studies regarding the institutional commitments necessary to establish a department dedicated to the study of race at the University of Chicago. This session will concern the unique contributions of HBCUs to Black studies and interdisciplinary research. Our next event, scheduled for March 12th, will concern the relationship between Black studies departments and interdisciplinary research centers with Tricia Rose and Farah Jasmine Griffin. Before we move on to introductions, I want to invite my friend and colleague, Lashaya Howie, to introduce herself, and then we'll move forward.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Lashaya Howie. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology here at the University of Chicago. I am also an alum of Howard University. So it is my esteemed pleasure to be here in this conversation this afternoon. Yes, so Marcus, did you introduce yourself?
Yes, I did. I forgot to say that I'm an alum of Morehouse College, so that is really pertinent to this conversation. Yeah, so I have the distinguished honor of introducing our distinguished guest today. So I will start with Joshua Myers. Joshua Myers is an associate professor of Africana Studies in the Department of Afro-American Studies at Howard University. He is author of We Are Worth Fighting For, A History of Howard University Student Protests, history of the Howard University student protests in 1989. In addition to serving on the board of the Association for the Study of Classical African Civilizations and the editorial board of the Compass, he works with DC area collectives, including Positive Black Folks in Action and the DC Black Power Chronicles. His research interests include Africana intellectual histories and traditions, Africana philosophy, critical university studies, and disciplinarity. His work has been published in Critical Ethnic Studies Journal, the Journal of African American Studies, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, the African Journal of Rhetoric, the Human Rights and Globalization Law Review, Liberator Magazine, and Pam Bazooka, among other literary spaces. So welcome, Joshua. Beverly Guy-Sheftall is the founding director of the Women's Research and Resource Center and Anna Julia Cooper Professor of Women's Studies at Spelman College. She is the recipient of numerous fellowships and awards, including, for example, the National Kellogg Fellowship and Spelman's Presidential Faculty Award for Outstanding Scholarship, and is past president of the National Women's Studies Association. She has published a number of texts within African American and women's studies, which have been noted as seminal works by other scholars, including, for example, Words of Fire, an anthology of African American feminist thought, Gender Talk, the Struggle for Equality in African American Communities with Janetta B. Cole, Traps, African American Men on Gender and Sexuality with the late Rudolph Byrd, and I Am Your Sister, collected in unpublished writings of Audre Lorde with Rudolph Byrd and Janetta B. Cole. Beyond the academy, she has been involved in a number of advocacy organizations, which include the National Black Women's Health Project, the National Coalition of 100 Black Women, and Black Women in Defense of Ourselves. And I would be remiss if I didn't also mention that Dr. Guy-Sheftall is one of my personal mentors and was an undergraduate professor for me while I was at Morehouse. So I'm really happy to have her here also. Just as a note about structure, we have a few questions sketched out for our panelists that we'll begin with, but we also hope to take a few questions at the end from the audience. So so please feel free to drop your questions in the Q&A box. But by way of beginning, I would like our panelists to talk a bit about your own intellectual biography. So how did you first become invested in Black studies and interdisciplinary research? And what have been some of the responses to and outcomes of formalizing Black studies or interdisciplinary research at your respective institutions? So Dr. Guy-Sheftall, I'll start with you and then we'll go on to Josh.
Okay, so I'm gonna date myself to say that I was a college student in between 1962 and 1966 when there was no Black studies and no women's studies. I started my journey into Black studies when I came back to Atlanta University in the English department. So I was originally a literary scholar. And by the way, I had African-American lit courses, no Black women writers in there, just male writers. And so when I came back to Atlanta University to do a master's degree in English, this began my formal journey into what I would call Black studies and Black women's studies. And I'm going to talk about those interchangeably, and then eventually women's studies. So I ended up doing a master's thesis on Faulkner's treatment of women, Black women, in his major novels. And so I started being really interested in the whole area of Black women's literary tradition. I started teaching at Spelman College in the English department in 1971. And one of the things that was the case, and not surprisingly, my students at that point, didn't know that there was a robust Black women's literary tradition. So a colleague of mine, Rose Van Bell, and I did the first anthology on Black women's literature called Sturdy Black Bridges, Visions of Black Women in Literature. And during that process, I interviewed Toni K. Bambara, who had published The Black Woman in 1970. And that put me on a journey to excavate Black women's robust literary, intellectual, political, and feminist lineage. And so it started there while I was teaching undergraduates at Spelman College. I decided not to get a PhD in English, which is where I would have been headed, but to get a PhD in American Studies at Emory. And that began my formal study of Black studies and women's studies. One of my early Black studies professors was Dolores Aldridge. And I ended up writing what I call a Black women's studies dissertation, Attitudes toward Black women from 1880 to 1920. And so I would say that is briefly my intellectual journey into Black studies and Black women's studies, briefly.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you all for inviting me, and I'm honored to be joined by Beverly Guy-Sheftall in this particular conversation. And my undergraduate work was at Howard University as well. And when I was there, I was fortunate to meet people who were dedicated to study, to what some have begun to call Black study. And this was outside of the curriculum, as much as it was connected to the curriculum. And the name of that group was the Kwame Ture Society. And what we would do is that we would devote time to extending the classroom, reading outside of what was assigned in the classroom. And that sort of connected me to really the Black radical tradition. And there was a number of ways in which that manifested for members of that collective. And one of those was student activism. And so I got involved with that on campus. And in trying to figure out how to go to the next step, to the next level, two members of that group decided that I should join them at Temple University to get a graduate degree in African American Studies. And from there, my commitment to really understanding the nature of this discipline sort of grew. I was advised by Nathaniel Norman, who is now in the AUC at Morehouse now. And he was actually working on a textbook in African American Studies, which is now out. It's called African American Studies, the Discipline and Its Dimensions. And through that particular work as his research assistant, I kind of gained a sense of clarity around this idea of African-American studies, not just as a content-based area, but as a disciplinary area, meaning how do we create standards and norms around how to approach the study of the Africana experience. That sort of became my own master's thesis and dissertation work. And so my dissertation ended up being on developing an intellectual history of the discipline, but trying to situate that intellectual history by way of clarifying the relationships between Africana studies and the Western disciplines. And so I spent a lot of time reading about the development of pretty much every Western discipline in the social sciences and the humanities. And so I wanted to clarify how Black people enter into those spaces, or gain some clarity about how Black people enter into those spaces and what we do while we're in those spaces that ended up creating the conditions for the intellectual trajectory that led directly to the emergence of Black studies. And so that's kind of my work. And I've been back at Howard since 2013. And that's really what we've been doing ever since, is trying to create a foundation that's distinct from what everyone else does in terms of methodology, in terms of epistemology, in terms of how we actually think about the nature of ideas and of knowledge as the foundation for doing Africana studies. And so that's where we are now.
Josh, I shouted out to you when I first came, but you had stepped out. So I'm very happy to be in the space with you.
Okay.
I do want to go back to this point about what is particular about Black studies at HBCUs, but before we get there, Josh, you mentioned, also studying the formation of, so-called traditional disciplines. So if for both of you, I have a similar but slightly different question in that regard. So one of the things that faces those of us doing this sort of work to actually formalize academic units in different places, and something in particular that we face here at UChicago is sort of the rhetoric around, well, these sorts of studies are happening in other disciplines and individuals are doing this sort of work in their respective areas. So why is a department necessary? So I would also then imagine, that's for what's happening at Chicago, which is a particular case. So if you could speak to that, but also for you all, I can imagine, and I know because I was an Afro major at Howard, sometimes it's configured as if Howard is a Black institution and different faculty members specialize in Black studies in different way, and it's sort of in the water, as people will say. Why would someone choose Africana studies as a major? And then slightly different, but the same for you, Dr. Guy-Sheftall, if most of the people at Spelman are identified as Black women, and Black women are at the center of everything, then why do you need a comparative women's studies major at a Black women's college? So whoever wants to start to answer that question.
Josh, you want to start? Mine might be more complicated. Mine might be more complicated than yours.
Okay. The difference is insurgency. To put it bluntly, traditional disciplines are not committed to insurgent practices of Black scholarship. They never will be, and we can never delude ourselves into thinking that can happen under the departmental structures that currently exist in those particular disciplines. Not just the departmental structure, but the extra academic structures in terms of even professional associations that determine the standards for what you do within those spaces. And so the people who they claim may be doing Africana studies within those traditional disciplines are often fighting those traditional disciplines in order to do that. And so Black studies as a formation, as a departmental formation, as an administrative unit within the discipline, basically means we can fight it together. We can fight these folks collectively, right? And that pretty much, to me, is what happens within the departmental structure. And that's why the National Council for Black Studies, which is the professional organization has recommended that African American studies units be departments, right? It gives us a little bit more. It doesn't resolve the fight, but it gives us a little bit more in terms of tools to wage this particular fight, this insurgency. That's actually, what Black Studies has always stood for. And so that's the administrative piece. There's also an intellectual piece, right? And I think sometimes when we think about race or, this movement now, anti-racism as sort of the grounds for doing Black studies, anti-racism that's loosely defined out of a particular narrow conception of that idea that is amenable to university diversity departments, right? Without saying too much, I think everybody's here with me, right? With that being sort of what they interpret as the grounds for Africana studies, we often miss that there's an epistemological struggle at the root of this disciplinary project as well, which means that what you count as knowledge matters. What you count as, ideas or theory matters. It's not just this notion of thinking about and studying Black life, it's how you go about thinking about and studying Black life. Sylvia Winter, at the end of her A Black Studies Manifesto, basically says, the war for a new episteme, right? This is our battle, this is our war now, right? And so Black studies, and in many ways, all of the other formations that come next, right? Women's studies, queer studies, so on and so forth, right? They're fighting an epistemological battle. And I think that has to be at the forefront of our minds, at the forefront of our consciousness, as we develop young people in the classrooms to really continue this particular war, is that we're trying to get rid of the Western disciplinarity that somehow has, counted as knowledge for everybody, that somehow has been used in many ways as another tool in the colonial toolbox. And so when people talk about, decolonization, and we sort of link it to the world beyond the United States, as if the United States universities don't also need to be decolonized, right? Especially HBCUs, which need decolonization, right? And so I think part of our claim in Africana studies is what we're doing is an insurgent practice. And to the extent that that's not happening in places where Black content studies becomes their claim to entrance into this conversation, then we can make a clear separation at that particular point. But I want us to remember that that insurgency also requires an epistemological break that I see, unfortunately, few of us are willing to continue.
So let me tell you what the initial resistance was at Spelman in 1981, when several of us imagined establishing Black feminist studies at Spelman. The first thing was, and Joshua, we, by definition, because we're a Black college, we're doing Black studies and women's studies by definition, okay? But so we're already doing that. There was not even any notion that this was an interdisciplinary project, and we think the disciplinary study is more relevant. So it was that we are already doing that by definition. Okay, that's what Black colleges do. That's what Black women's colleges do. So when we said no, we're not doing that. We're not already doing that. That was news. In addition to which, and I don't know, Josh, if you had this thing, Black feminism was a contested, and I would say demonized politics in the early 80s. It was perceived to be something that white women do. It was perceived to be anti-male. It was perceived to be lesbian. It was perceived to be not insurgent, but disruptive and divisive. So we also had to make the political case that Black feminist studies, which is at the intersection of Black studies and women's studies, is a legitimate intellectual, political, academic project. And we used the 1982 first anthology of Black women's studies. All the women are white, all the Blacks are men, but some of us are brave. Black women's studies, to say that there is a field developing called Black women's studies. So we had political pushback, more than disciplinary pushback. And I would say that we also had conservative gender politics pushback, because we made it clear we're going to be doing radical Black feminist studies, which is intersectional, which means we're also going to do sexuality studies. We're going to do race, gender, and sexuality studies. Well, the sexuality part raises up more red flags. So that's what we experienced. So it was, you know, are you sure that this is not going to fade quickly, because it's not rigorous? We don't really know what it is, and we already do it.
Yeah, and I would say that conservative orientation that's present at HBCUs was one of the most pressing issues in terms of the development of these areas in those particular institutions. It wasn't necessarily just a lack of resources, which most people would say, well, that's the problem at HBCUs. There was also a conservative element that, thank God for the student activists, right? They continuously fought back against that element and opened up space for the kind of insurgent politics that I'm talking about, right? And so at Howard University, I mean, it goes in waves, right? And so the late 1960s, you see the university responding to the students, and then there's like a retrenchment, right? In the early 80s, and then the students respond again in the late 80s, and then it's another retrenchment in the 90s. I mean, and so it's like, it goes in cycles like that, because, you know, HBCUs aren't inherently radical. They aren't inherently grounded in doing something different from the status quo in terms of higher education. Black people push them to be that, right? You know, Black women at Spelman push Spelman to be something different, right? And so there's a really important element of this, and that's why I think teaching is key here. Not just research, but teaching, because it is the students who push a lot of this change.
You know, what I really appreciate about what you all are saying is that it kind of speaks to the title of our campaign. You know, like the sort of hashtag is more than diversity. And I think that what you all are saying about HBCUs is that, or what you all, the insight that you all sort of are providing is that descriptive representation is not enough, right? It's not enough to have people of color, Black people, women within departments. We need that, but then we also need, as you mentioned, Josh, like a sort of break with the sort of common epistemological maneuvers that happen in traditional disciplines, right? And we're hoping that something like Black Studies provides or sort of is the occasion for such a break. So I really appreciate that. And Josh, I also think that your research on Cedric Robinson is definitely showing up in this conversation. So I appreciate that also. So I wanted to follow up with this question. So what you all have just sort of provided is like the history that gets us to this sort of moment in which Howard has an African American Studies department, Spelman has a Comparative Women's Studies department. And, you know, these departments are living and ongoing. And so I'd like you to talk a bit more about the current status of these disciplines or departments at your respective institutions, what they provide for the institutions, or what the responses to or the outcomes of these departments currently are. And one question that Lashaya and I also were thinking about along these same lines is there something particular about being trained in Black Studies at an HBCU or Comparative Women's Studies at Spelman? Is there something particular to that is nameable? So I'll stop there. Dr. Guy-Sheftall, I guess we'll start with you.
Okay, so the first thing I want to say is Comparative Women's Studies thrives at Spelman because we've had a lot of external funding. I mean, and let me just mention, this was strategic on our part. We located comparative women's studies, and I think you all may do the same thing, within a center, the Women's Research and Resource Center. It's very difficult to raise external funds for just a program. So we wanted to have a broader rubric, because we also wanted our program which is really Black feminist studies or Black women's studies, to have an activist component. And we also talked the college into having the Women's Center be in charge of the Spelman archive so that it would have a research. But what I was really thinking about is, because I knew Spelman College was not going to support comparative women's studies out of its college budget. So from day one, 1981, we had a Charles Stewart Mott Foundation grant. And we have had external funding since the beginning, including my salary, which came out of a Mott endowed professorship set of funds. And we have had external funding since 1981. And we're about, what, is that about 40 years? When we were really committed to race, gender, and sexuality studies, we were able to go to the Arcus Foundation. The other thing that we were able to do, which is very unusual, and Josh would know this, at a small, well, not small, at a Black college, we were able to get an endowment grant from the Ford Foundation. $1 million, which we had to match, which means that we're not dependent upon not dependent totally on the resources of the college or the whims and likes and dislikes of who's in the administration. So we got that endowment grant. The other thing that we wanted endowed professors. And so the most recent one is we're going to have the first queer studies endowed professor at an HBCU and located within our unit. So the success has to do with the external funding. It has to do, I think, with the broad project. Josh mentioned activism. We are really committed to activism. So it's not surprising, for example, that women's studies students did that Nellie campaign. And it's not surprising that our Spelman College archives has the Audre Lorde papers and the Tony Cape Barrett papers, and we're in the process of trying to, get some more. So we were thinking about more on Spingarn, but our archives is not autonomous. So right now we are doing well. And in some ways, we are kind of autonomous. I don't mean autonomous in the strict sense, but because we have funding and because we have carved out a territory that really nobody else wants. Nobody, we're the ones that do sexuality stuff. So, I would like to believe that when I step down as director, because I've been director since the very beginning, that we'll do a national search and we'll be able to get a really good replacement because the person is going to come there with resources. So I would say we're doing okay.
I'll start with what you said in terms of whether or not the outcomes of having taken or majored in or been involved in Black studies should be different at HBCUs. I think it should be, because I think that's happening. Not all the time. I think it happens at Howard. I can only speak of Howard authoritatively in terms of what our students have been able to do and accomplish over the past 10, 15, 20 years.
Can you talk a little louder, Josh?
Oh, sure.
Okay, just a little.
I was saying that I think, I can only authoritatively speak about Howard in terms of what our students have been able to do over the past 20 or so years. But I think it's also important. I think this bit of history in terms of what happened in 1968, 1969 is important because, the students fought for a department, but they also fought for a Black university, right? This concept of a Black university, which is literally, we want everything, right? To be oriented towards this insurgent practice. And so we got the department, and so the struggle has been ever since is how does having this department infect the other areas of the university, not just in terms of the academic areas, but holistically, right? Because that's what the students were literally fighting for in terms of the Black university. So I think about Vincent Harding, who also taught at Spelman, writing about the Black university in Ebony magazine. He says, copies of, dark copies of dying whiteness are no longer needed. One of my favorite lines of his. why are we copying these other institutions, these white stream institutions, right? Also, Toni Cade, when she writes about realizing the dream of the Black university. And so those are my models when I think about our current status. It's like, okay, the department can thrive, but is the Black university thriving? Are we thriving as a Black university? And what are our measures for that? Are they these notions of Black excellence where we have celebrity alumni who are doing great things, or is it something much deeper, right? And so I think for us, that's an ongoing struggle. And again, to give more credit to our students, who were students in the 1980s who were able to stabilize the department at a moment where neoliberalism was on the ascent, and Reaganism and all these other, the end of the Cold War, and why would we need Black studies down now? And so the students at that time basically created a campaign called the Afro-American Studies Collective. I'm messing up the name. But there were students like Christopher Cathcart and Todd Shaw, who's now at the University of South Carolina, political scientist. They created African American Studies Push Collective. That's it. They created a campaign to ensure that every Howard University student took a class in African American Studies in order to graduate. And so I tell my students this all the time, when they see that requirement on their schedule, it's not because the administration decided that this was necessary. It's because students decided this was necessary. And so now every student has to pass through us, which means that we hope there's a difference, there's a change in how they see the world. If that's not true, we're failing, right? And so that is probably how I would answer that particular question. It's an ongoing struggle. It's an ongoing fight. We can't for a second rest. Because and we'll probably talk about this in a private session more, but there are conservative forces that are ready for us to slip up, right? And so, that's the status of Howard right now.
Josh, one of the things I would say is, and I would say Howard students have been a model. Howard students have been a model in the HBCU context for the kind of radical political activism you're talking about. I would say that that's not typical at HBCUs. And I would say that the transformation, the transformation at Spelman College began when Janetta Cole came there as president. And I would say that the comparative women's studies and all of that came really from faculty. So I'm always referring to Howard University students as a model for pushing toward a Black university, because I don't think that is necessarily characteristic of all HBCUs.
Yeah. And I think what happens, and this is something that I realized when I was working on the book on 1989, is that a lot of people believe that, actually agree with what you just said, Professor, and after the students, got rid of Lee Atwater in 89, there were calls from Morris Brown. There were calls from Tennessee State. There were calls from Morgan State, Coppin State, University of District of Columbia, for those students to come and help us with our stuff. I mean, literally for the next year, 2 years, students who were involved in that protest would literally go to these other HBCUs and meet with student leaders, and in many ways provide material support to the work that was being done, and literally Black studies programs, and not just HBCUs, HWCUs as well. There were many Black studies programs that emerged in the 90s because of them.
Yeah.
And so absolutely, I think there's something to be said about that. And I think there's also something to be said about the attempts for them to create organizations that went beyond where you were actually located as a student. So there were student organizations on the level of SNCC that were imagined and started throughout the 80s and the early 90s. A lot of them don't last as long as SNCC did, but there was an attempt. We have to create an inter-HBCU consortium of students that can do this work, because we can't just rely on one group of students, because you know how that works out at any end. They attack that one group and then move it over, right? And so there was that organizing being done. I think that's an important story about I think they're now Generation X, right? We call them Generation in terms of their relationship to this long struggle?
I am so glad that both of you brought up the long struggle and the current struggles that are happening both in the realm of students at historically Black colleges, and also, working alongside, sometimes working against faculty, and oftentimes working against admin in the current neoliberal university. So one of the things that I think sometimes happens, particularly at so-called elite, predominantly and historically white colleges, is that I think HBCUs get resigned to like a historical moment in which there is intellectual production happening there when, scholars were not able to go to more elite white institutions, or even student struggle. So, in the age of social media, I remember there was a moment where there was a lot of I am insert this predominantly white institution to kind of raise awareness about Black students being in those spaces. And again, there was like a conversation that seemed to leave out the ongoingness of these struggles at historically Black colleges. So I'm so thankful that you all pointed that out. So we also have a question about something that might happen in earnest in departments, hopefully not your own, but also a perception that departments dedicated to Black studies, or more broadly, the study of race, has a tendency to marginalize other categories of difference. So especially we're thinking about gender and sexuality. I know Dr. Guy-Sheftall, you've been at the forefront of that. So you can definitely speak to that. So the question here is about what sort of infrastructural commitments are necessary from an institution, and perhaps even outside of an institution, for integrating robustly things like frameworks such as queer studies, feminist studies, also thinking about sometimes there's a conception that Black studies is US centric, although those of us who are within the discipline knows that, that has never been the case. So if you all can speak about those other ever expanding commitments to other categories of difference, but also like thinking broadly about Black experiences within the framework of Black studies.
Well, I think that's been a challenge for Black studies as a field. That is having what we would call an intersectional queer Black feminist lens within the field. And I don't, it'd be interesting to hear what Josh has to say, but I think that this was a critique in 1982. This was a critique. The Black studies tended to be masculinist. Women's studies tended to be racist. And I would say that there are definitely remnants of heterosexism and the absence of a look at the importance of queerness in the field in general. And I'm not just saying that as a committed Black feminist. When we started the program at Spelman, we looked at doctoral programs in Black studies. We looked at syllabi in Black studies programs, and there was a visible absence of what we would call intersectional Black feminist theory inside of Black studies, which is for me where intersectional Black feminist theory comes from. It comes most of these people came out of Black studies. So I would say that this is a real challenge. And I can't tell you how many spaces that I've been in which we've had really robust conversations about it. And I would say that in general, if you don't have Black feminists in those spaces, it is less likely to happen. So I have fantasized about serious conversations with my Black Studies colleagues about how we can have the field be more attentive to intersectional Black feminist studies, which would mean to me also a serious engagement with Black queer studies.
Yeah, yeah. I think structurally there are problems, and I know at Howard we've been addressing those problems. We've had this for a while, but we now have every semester 2 sections of the course called the Black Woman in America. We also have the director of the Women's Studies Graduate Certificate Program is a part of our department. And so that becomes part of what our department, that becomes one of the strengths of our departments at this particular stage. But it's still ongoing work. I talk to students who are queer. I talk to students who deal with intersectionality in terms of their approach to activism and approach to understanding their Blackness. And we all fall short in many respects. But I think ultimately this too is part of the rot of Western civilization and how that creates particular forms of knowledge production that we have not completely excised out of our consciousness, which means also that we have to have a way of approaching the world that doesn't go through the notion that what Western civilization designates as man, as the thinking subject, as the sort of center of knowledge, is not reproduced as us, right? And so we have to come up with a different way of thinking. We have to come up with a different philosophy of life, right? Not even come up with it, but to sort of reanimate those that were, as Ngugi wa Thiong'o would say, were dismembered. And so absolutely it's ongoing work. And I think there are a number of approaches that have been modeled that many more people in Black studies need to pay more attention to.
I mean, one of the programs that I'll call out, and I'm only calling this one out because I'm very familiar with it, the Black Studies program at Northwestern, for example, is one of those programs that has tangled with the issues that we're talking about. But that's just one that I think about in particular is the Northwestern University's PhD program, and it probably is because they've got a lot of queer studies scholars inside of their PhD program and at Northwestern, and I'm sure there are other ones, but that's the one that I'm more familiar with because a Spelman alum, Celeste Watkins, is one of the persons that's there. E. Patrick Johnson was there. Dwight McBride was there. So you have queer studies pioneers who were connected to that program, and that may be the main reason why that's the case.
I too fantasize about a robust intellectual intersectional engagement within Black Studies, Dr. Guy-Sheftall, so I appreciate that. And Josh, as you were saying, I also appreciate the idea that this is an ongoing struggle and not something to be resolved with one institutional commitment or another, but sort of ongoing conversation. We have about 15 minutes left, so we wanted to pose one more question to you all from our list of prefigured questions, and I want to invite those in the audience to add any other burning questions you have to the Q&A, and we'll switch to that. But we have one question about sort of intra-institutional sort of engagement, right? So HBCU students are often admitted to the University of Chicago for pipeline research programs, for example, Leadership Alliance. Like I had maybe 2 or 3 Spelman students last summer, for example. And we're also admitted to the University of Chicago for graduate studies. So I'm, a graduate of Morehouse. Lashea is a graduate of Howard. We have a graduate of Spelman in comparative human development, a graduate of Howard in the English department, et cetera. In this way, however, HBCUs often sort of operate as what we might call feeder schools for the University of Chicago, right? And so obviously there are more robust ways in which the University of Chicago might engage HBCUs. And I wonder if we can brainstorm with you all with what those ways might be. One thing I'd like to mention is that Columbia University just announced a partnership with Howard University with regard to, I think it's you can correct me if I'm wrong, Josh, but it's the Columbia University Press and Howard University Press working together to publish books in Black Studies. So that was one collaboration that I thought was really interesting, but I'd like to hear from you all about what this department at the University of Chicago might do in order to more robustly engage historically Black colleges and universities.
Well, I can't speak to the Columbia thing because they ain't asked me about that. So I found out when y'all found out.
Not surprising.
Yeah, about that. So Du Bois in 1898 wrote an essay called The Study of Negro Problems. And in that particular, after he excoriated these white social scientists, he said, we got people that can do the work at HBCUs, but y'all got resources up there.
Talk a little louder. Can't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, okay. That's better, thank you.
He said, y'all got people, he said, we got people that do the work at HBCUs, but y'all got resources up there. And so if y'all are serious about this, we can create partnerships where y'all should share the resources and we can share the expertise. Alas, white institutions weren't serious in 1898 about whether or not they wanted to embark upon this kind of work. Now we have Black people in those white institutions, and I think a lot about what June Jordan said in her essay, Black Studies, Bringing Back the Person, and how, you know, there's this community and family that Black students seek when they go into these HWCUs, and how out of that something different might emerge. And so to the extent that there are Black studies units in these particular places, we have to have collaboration and exchange that is about more than individual scholars development and more about the collective development of the disciplines themselves. And for me, that's it. How do we create community? How do we create collective work around where we are? Because I think some places, you know, the Black Studies unit is totally isolated. And so if you had, you know, some kind of collective relationship with, you know, what happened within an entire institution, like, you know, say we had, you know, I always dream of actually taking over an entire HBCU that may be struggling financially, right? And so let's go down to this one HBCU in Mississippi and let's just take over the whole thing. And so what would happen to Black Studies if in those not narrow, but in those smaller units, vis-a-vis the larger universities at HWCUs, if we had those kinds of experiences happening in those kinds of places. So it reminds me, of course, of the Institute of the Black World and how they tried to create an institutional space for Black Studies directors to come every summer and have conversations about what are you doing, how is what you are trying to accomplish related to X, Y, and Z. And so we need more of that kind of exchange, I think, because I think the only place that we really talk about stuff right now is like on social media. So everybody that's like doing cutting edge stuff, right, is in conversation, but only on social media. What happens if we just have a retreat, right? Or something like that. I think those things are actually doable immediately. But I think the larger project might be at some level really sharing resources that are geared towards that kind of collective development.
Yeah, John, I agree with that. Let me just say this too. This experience that Josh and I have never in all of my thousands of years in the academy been invited by an elite white institution like University of Chicago, invited to say, two people from Black college, come here and help us think through the establishment of our program. That just doesn't happen. Would you agree, Josh? Okay. So this is not really even sharing resources. This is saying that we value what Black faculty are doing at HBCUs, and not about student affairs, but about intellectual, disciplinary, academic stuff. So I would say this is a possible model. Invite us to come and speak to you about our expertise. The other thing that I'm going to say is, and you all know this, you rarely see Black college faculty, I don't care who they are, you rarely see Black college faculty as major public intellectuals in the world. They're almost all from elite white universities. That's whether it's on CNN or wherever. I know without even asking, they're going to be from white institutions. So we need to get elite white colleges to involve Black scholars in their deliberations. I mean, I am frequently, I cannot tell you all of the places that I go. I'm the only person from an HBCU who has ever been there, ever, to talk about anything. And so we need to be a part of the intellectual mix at white college. And that is just not difficult to do. But I just think that people do not see faculty members and scholars at HBCUs as equal to their star Black faculty at white colleges. And I won't call anybody's names, but we know who they all are. And of course, those Black scholars that I'm talking about don't suggest us either. I mean, I'm always deliberately saying, sometimes when people call me, ask so-and-so who's at another Black college to come there and also give a talk. So I think resource sharing, genuine partnerships, a valuing of the work that Black scholars do at Black colleges around a whole range of things would be a beginning.
Thank you.
And then I'll just quickly add, it don't always have to be formal, right? And that's sometimes we get into thinking that we have to have somebody sign off on this in order for us to be able to do it, right? I got a Zoom license, y'all got a Zoom license. We can just do what we got to do, right? I mean, there's always have to be, you don't have to ask permission all the time. Anyway.
Yeah.
Thank you both for that. We do have a couple of questions from the audience. So this one is from Professor Eve Ewing. Given what Dr. Myers has said about these cycles of re-entrenchment and the need for constant insurgency, if you were starting from where we are now, we mean the University of Chicago, what lessons would you bring to the work of starting a department? What would you do differently to promote the strength and sustainability of the department?
That's an excellent question. Thank you. One of the things that has to happen, I think, a lot of times other disciplines will say that we don't like to inbreed, meaning we don't like to hire our own. I don't know if Black studies should follow those particular models. In fact, I mean, if you just look at the history of University of Chicago sociology, right? They inbreeded all the way too, and that's why they became one of the most, the discipline would consider one of the most influential schools. And I think that's one of the things that we got in trouble replicating, this notion that we're scared to hire our own. That creates continuity. And I think one of the things that happens is that when we have so much new blood in these particular spaces, there's a lack of institutional memory that then allows them to recreate the problems or be vulnerable to those cycles as they happen again, right? And so you need somebody there who knew what happened last time and can help us navigate this. But I think part of it is also, wow. The students, how do you maintain a presence after you graduated? Because if you're saying that this is only possible because of student insurgency, that means the students have to have a stake when they become alumni. So how do you organize alumni of Black studies departments? I think that's going to be a major thing going forward. It should have been something we thought about earlier. But that's going to be a major thing because our students always go out and do great things and have great relations. I mean, we have people doing all kinds of stuff. But if they were organized, the conservative assaults against our spaces would be much harder to mount. So I would say organize students, organize alumni, because the faculties in these departments really can't do it alone. And once it becomes faculty centered in a way that might hurt us. I think that can create vulnerability if you don't have, as Professor Guy-Sheftall says, if you don't have that external funding source, right? And so be really, I think, conscious of how you organize both students and organize alumni of these particular spaces.
I want to really say amen to that. We started not very long ago, knowing who our majors were, emailing them and keeping up with them. I mean, we didn't realize how important it was to keep up with our graduating majors who are just doing all kinds of things. We include them on our committees. For example, we have an annual Tony K. Bombera Scholar Activism Conference. They are on the planning committee. Now, COVID has made that easier, but it is amazing to us. It was like, how come we didn't think of that earlier? We even have Morehouse students on their markers. Ramon is on there. So
I'm on it too.
Yes. So I can't tell you how important it is to keep your majors in the loop. I mean, we had to, when I was out on leave, we had to invite Moya Bailey there to teach my courses. So I really want to underscore how important it is to think of your unit as ongoing and that your majors, some of them may even be donors at a certain point. In fact, when we had the Women's Center Endowment Campaign, Moya got her parents to write a check to us for $100. I mean, that's really important that they saw themselves as potential donors. So I absolutely agree with that. And we didn't think about that at the very, very beginning. The other thing that I would say, and this will probably not be an issue for you at University of Chicago, we mostly at Spelman, and I don't know if this is true of Howard, we mostly, for budgetary reasons, hire junior faculty who at the very beginning, are going to be thinking about tenure. I would say when you get your department going, you should get a budget to have both junior and senior faculty, because senior faculty can come in and hit the ground running, and not be as preoccupied with getting tenure. So that makes a huge difference, and University of Chicago can have a mix.
You heard it from the experts. We need junior and senior faculty.
Junior and senior faculty
for this department to work out. I want to say sorry to the folks who included other questions in the Q&A. We need to close out because we're at time. Thank you all so much for tuning in, and thank you, Josh Myers and Beverly Guy-Sheftall, for engaging us in what was really a robust and exciting conversation. Thanks to Lashaya for moderating with me, and thanks to CSRPC for making this event happen. So thank you all, and I think with that, we'll just close out.
I mean, they can email me if they want to ask me those questions.
Yes.
I didn't see the questions, but if you want to email me, that's fine.
Yes, please. Yeah, I think you can find Josh Myers pretty easily on the Howard website or on your own website.
And same thing with me, same thing with me. I'm on the website too, on Spelman website, not on Howard's website.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.